Hello. I have to say first off that it is an incredible honor to be here. This is my first time in Jamaica, and I've, for many years, been dreaming of finding a way and finding the means by which to create a body of work that comes out of this beautiful country. And so it's an extraordinary honor to be here on this, my first night here. And I guess what I'd like to do is to give a quick shout out to my team, the people who helped me to arrive at this moment. Before I got here, I spent 2 weeks, Megan and I, Syria and this year tonight. We were in how many museums? Like 10 different museums in London, going through the history of portraiture from the 17th and 18th century, specifically trying to tie a connection between Great Britain and this island, and to look at some of the beautiful and terrible past that exists. You know, but once you're on the ground, you sort of want to throw all that away and sort of pretend as though that's not there. You're sort of like really well equipping yourself and then putting yourself out into the real world. And hopefully some of that will filter into it. The idea here, though, is to create a beautiful series of paintings, mega paintings in scale, in color and depth, to have them on display in London, hopefully in the fall, and to begin a conversation about how they can then be seen here in Jamaica. So you may very well be seeing me and my camera crew roving through the streets. We're also working on a documentary process here, so it's more than just paintings on a wall. This is also the story behind how you get to these paintings. And so, what was that day like? Who are these people that you're interacting with? So oftentimes you'll take a break and say, all right, well, let's just go somewhere where people are relaxing, social zone. All right, so you know, it's always weird trying to figure out exactly how to talk about this because I live it. I'm inside of it every day, and so all of these ideas that you're looking at are things that slowly creep up with me over time. And you know, it starts off with really simple moments like this, which are the portrait. I was growing up in South Central Los Angeles and studying art history and painting in a small art school that my mother sent me to as a means of getting out of the streets. And she didn't want me and my twin brother to be in that environment too much, so she encouraged us all to study art on the weekends. And what I fell in love with was the art that I saw in the museums that we went to go see on the weekends as part of that program. And a lot of it was the portrait. I started to realize that there was something really engaging about looking at another human being, much more so than looking at a bowl of fruit or looking at a landscape. There's something about the human figure that inspires us, that draws us all in. I guess we're just curious about ourselves in that way. But these earlier paintings were inspired by basic portraiture. Look back there, there's this mugshot profile that I saw in the streets of Harlem one day after having graduated from Yale and gone through all of the formal studies. I saw this mugshot and began thinking about mugshots as a type of portraiture. What do mugshots say? It's a type of code in there that says that the sitter is divorced from power. There's a sense in which you're being displayed, fully, frontally displayed, side displayed. It's almost the absolute exercise of powerlessness, the absolute opposite of what type of art still goes. It's the absolute opposite of the type of art that I was drawn to in European works from France and from England and from Italy. Those works were about the rich and the powerful who could afford to hire the most noted artists of their time to create celebrations of their individuality, to create pictures of them bold, confident, self-possessed. The mugshot in many ways was the opposite of that. And so it sparked something in me. It sparked a desire to create an investigation around how to fuse the language of old school painting, which I love, and to sort of dismantle that and rebuild it, reconstitute it with people who happen to look like I do. And it began very simply at the Studio Museum in Harlem. After I graduated from Yale in 2000, I became the artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem, which allowed me to work on 125th Street, which is this street that's packed with a very vibrant black community. It was very different from the one that I grew up in. The energy there was really intense. It was very energetic. I wanted to be able to get in my work something about what that was, to be able to taste that a bit in art. And so I began inviting complete strangers, individuals, into my studio and asking them to pose. And most people said no. As you might imagine, it's kind of tough being in a big city where most people have their guard on to tell a complete stranger, would you mind following me to my studio while I make a drawing of you, a painting of you? But there were a few people who said yes to this, and what came out of it were very basic portraits. And through those sittings, through those moments of sitting down and painting someone, we began small conversations about art history, why it is that I love these old classical paintings. And after a while, I began asking some of the guys who were sitting for me what it is that they liked within the history of art, or what specific paintings that they saw in the art history books that were on my shelves that they responded to. So pretty soon this was about my love for painting, but it was also about how certain individuals wanted themselves to be seen, how they sort of wanted to have a kind of echo of what was in those books. This is so much about the history of art, but I think it's also the history of posturing, the history of posing, the history of putting out a type of armor of masculinity. This work is about Black America, but it's also about Black masculinity, the construction of what it means to be a man, a Black man specifically in America in the 21st century. I think so much of what we see are received notions of how to comport monkey, notions of authenticity, autonomy. These things are arrived at culturally. And in some ways, my work is trying to unpack some of what we perceive culturally. And in that sense, we're looking at the template, let's go to the old school version of these paintings. This performance has been done before, hundreds of years ago. What my work attempts to do in many ways is to elucidate the fact that the emperor oftentimes has no clothes. There is a very strong and well-realized vocabulary around what power looks like in a painting. You look at these paintings of men on horseback, but actually when I went to go recreate those paintings, I hired Hollywood horses that wouldn't freak out when the flashes went off. I hired people to sit on those horses, but it didn't look like that because man in relationship to a horse is a lot smaller. So art historically, the artists were implicit working with the sitters to create this lie, this fantasy of power and control, this illusion that David creates in those paintings of Napoleon, where he can simply control the entire horse with steam. This fantasy around control and domination goes certainly into the depiction of men, but it also goes into the depiction of women in painting. And in so much as this work is an investigation of masculinity, I think it's also about the absence of that in painting. What you'll see later in this work is a new body of work that specifically moved into the streets of New York and targeted young Black women between the ages of 18 and 35. I think it's always important to look at this age group, this 18 to 35 age group. It has so much more to do with marketing and the ways in which American popular culture is about marketing and about creating a type of delicious, perfected, irresistible image of what it means to be attractive, fully formed, and vibrant in the world. That image then becomes beamed out to the rest of the world, whether it be Brazil, India, China. Senegal. And in some ways, the rest of the world responds to America's notions of what it feels like or looks like to be fully formed, which in many ways, Americans themselves don't know where those images come from, because they're echoes of more received notions of how to be. My work is sure about some of these circular and confusing notions of self and wholeness, but I think at their base they're about looking in the mirror. I paint a lot of different people, I paint all over the world, but in the end I think I'm painting something about myself. Why do I choose to go to these places? That says something about me. Who do I choose to think? That says something about me. In some sense, what you're looking at is one big self-portrait, one big playground in which I decide to go out into the world and to look at things that confuse me, things that provoke me, things that delight. And what I try to do inside of myself is not to set any rules or to say that we can't do this, we can't do that. I think that when I feel uncomfortable, oftentimes I'll want to run towards that space as opposed to against it. My goal there is to heighten a sense of a world picture. And the goal of any artist, I think, or the responsibility of an artist would certainly be to follow through on all of those things that we want to not necessarily answer. I hate preachy art. I hate people have all the answers. Not for that. I think what's much more interesting is when you don't know at all how to proceed. And that's what happens on a one-to-one basis with each and every person that I meet, with each and every interaction that happens, whether it be a young man that I meet in the streets of New York, or someone who happens to be minding their own business trying to get to work in the shanties of Mumbai. This body of work is about chance. You never know when it's going to happen, but in the end, there's these big monumental paintings that come out of it. And someone who's minding their own business and trying to get to work one day ends up on the walls of a museum. Historically, in order to end up on the walls of a museum, you'd have to be a general, you would have to be a leader or some sort of captain of industry. This type of monumentality is something that was felt based on going out to the world and dominating the world on some level, being able to make yourself visible on a level that demanded the respect of the public. In many ways, that visibility can be looked back on in latter years as being deplorable. Many of the fruits of empire give rise to grand, beautiful capitals such as London and Paris. But in the end, these notions of empire make for beautiful portrait making as well. And those portraits are things that I oftentimes use as the starting point for the world stage paintings. The world stage started in China. It's a painting project that basically has me leaving New York and going out into the world and doing the same thing that I started doing in New York, but taking myself outside of my comfort zone. My work in some ways could be criticized at that point for really knowing exactly what America was, what this sort of urban look and feel was, and had, in many ways, I think for myself, I needed to sort of adjust or shake up what that language was, and so I just sort of pushed myself out into the world. I had a very good friend who was working in Beijing, who was an artist as well. He invited me out. And one thing that I started to realize is that they had these lies and picture telling as well. And those were in the social, the revolutionary portraits that were done in the Mao years, the Cultural Revolution. And so what you're seeing here are my reinterpretations of those images. You'll see that there's images of young, happy peasants who are being told about a bright future that they may not see. But these images are being posted all over the countryside. And this idea of an image giving a population a sense of what is real and what's possible are things that I wanted to sort of capture in the sense in which I was really kind of coming to terms with the ways in which Black American realities were very much manufactured the same way. So you get young Black men taking on those impossible smiles, and it feels very different. First off, a lot of those guys didn't want to smile like that when asked to do the poses, because it was not the sort of swagger that was in a lot of the other works. But there is something kind of weird and off-putting about those words. I actually can't help but to smile sometimes when looking at them. I think oftentimes when thinking about propaganda, we oftentimes think about big nation states. We think about big projects that go on in the world to tell big lies, or to lead big wars, and move big population groups. And I think that what I'm trying to do in this is to personalize it a little bit more, because oftentimes the way that you convince someone is on a one-to-one basis, and that they think painting is best of that, because painting is a medium that communicates to you on a one-to-one basis, one person at a time. It's very hard to tele-visualize painting. Even this doesn't get to what the essence of looking at a real painting is. And so, getting that repeat effect, getting that echo of the smile, directly interfacing these young Black men, created, I think, a type of breakthrough for me. It was at this point that I began thinking that not only was portrait making something that I was interested in, but I think what I was also interested in was this intersection between the life that I've lived and the interests that I've built up at this point in my life, and the ways that they sort of intersect with not only this very narrow field of Black America, but increasingly Western European easel painting, late Han Chinese depictions of social mobility. And so once that window cracked open, it became very easy for me to start to imagine different incarnations of what's possible in dress code, body language, the performance of self, the insistence of tradition, the importance of sign, the impeccable and almost exquisite framing that goes on in each one of these paintings of the hand-lacquered red with intricate gold leafing is only possible by having not only a well-trained hand. I've spent years learning how to paint quite studiously, but in that same period of time, I was also evolving a studio practice that allowed for me to begin working with assistants so that I could concentrate on the figures, these increasingly more and more complex fields, these backgrounds with leaves and flowers in millions of parts, began to create a much more broader type of picture making. So now it was taking photos. The process is you meet someone in the streets, you take their photo, you bring that photo back home, back to the studio, and then you begin manipulating that photo with Photoshop, heightening and diminishing color, removing features. Oftentimes what you'll see here is that the final painting looks very, very, very different from what happened in the studio, that first moment. So as the viewer, you have to ask yourself, what is true? I'm sitting here telling you these people are actual. I'm sitting here telling you this was a real moment with a real person. But to what extent have I, the artist, taken things out of this, altered things? So in some senses, what you're looking at is a very old tradition of painting, which is the tradition of taking a hairy stick and colored paste and mixing it around and you get this magical transformation. But in another sense, what you have is a very much more sophisticated painting of the 21st century notion of what is real. Everything on the picture plane right now is suspect. Is that the actual moment? Is that the actual person? In many shows, what I'll do is I'll actually have the actual people 9 out of 10 times, but then I'll have one fake pairing of people in the paintings, and the viewer never knows which person it is. So you look at an entire exhibition of the work, you look at all of these people, in this case from Nigeria, and you'll never know if this was an actual moment or if this is a complete fraudulent moment, a manufactured moment. What am I doing there? I think what I'm doing there is I'm trying to get that sense in which nothing is certain. Much as a viewer and as an artist and as a practitioner, I know that this is the manipulation of colored paste and hairy stick. I know that this is illusion making. And so for the viewer, what I'm trying to do is to recreate that sensation of falsehood, to recreate that sense of imbalance or insecurity or not quite knowing that you're home. Every time you're looking at something, you've never quite made it clear to yourself that you fully arrived. What you're looking at here is some amazing portraits that you find all over West Africa. Sculptures that are made out of cement many times, many of them in terrible disrepair because of the weather. I wanted to document some of those sculptures, but I also wanted to create paintings that responded to them specifically. So what you're seeing here are the before and after shots. So the painting, you'll see, and then the sculptures after. The idea was to leave China and to go to another part of the world that I had some sort of emotional story to or access to or some sort of trigger for me. The world stage, this project that I'm doing, always has to be some place that is about this conversation America has with the outside world. When I say America, I guess it starts with me. My father's Nigerian. So when I went to Africa, I went to Nigeria. And when I went to Nigeria, I was going to a foreign country because I grew up in Southern California. My father and mother broke up before I was born. Father returning to Africa, mother raising me in America. So I had all of these ideas about Africanness, had these I think, romantic televisualized fantasies around what Africa was, and sort of return to a very black power empowered state. And the realities that are there are complex and many. My work in Africa was, sure, a desire to kind of go back to my roots, but I think also to come to terms with some very conflicted feelings I had surrounding how I belonged there. Meeting family for the first time and being accepted as once African and American and sort of insider and outsider. This collapse, this desire to be at once heroic and epic and to take real pride and joy in the history of art history and to criticize it is my life's work. It's my call. My call is, in some ways, to be at once outside and inside of the system. I want to stand outside of the history of art and say how many terrible and dark chapters exist there. But I also want to be inside of it and to make these high-priced luxury goods for wealthy consumers, to be able to go all over the place and to document what goes on inside of my head. You know, this is a real conflicted state. But I have to be honest with myself. I have to scratch that itch. You know, that's the only responsibility we have as artists, is to be true to that urge. And luckily my urges dovetail into larger conversations about the world, who we are as a society, and my place within it. Thank you.